Okay, we're at slide 49. The title is Pain Threshold and Tolerance. As we've spoken, it's completely subjective and depends on pain perception. So it exceeds the biological level, and we've talked about this already. I want to refer you to the second and fourth point of slide 50, starting with the phrase role socialization, which is an interesting aspect that takes the understanding of pain as a process, as a multifactorial process, whereas if you have a role to play in certain situations, that might alter the way you perceive or react to pain. Obviously, there's other reasons or influences such as genetics and gender and culture and as we said, expectations and experiences. But here we come and say not only that, we have both someone having a role, let's say a leader, a parent, a commander in the military, that will react differently to pain because of how that person perceives himself and his role towards others. It's not just about him or herself, it's about how others will perceive this. And then we have, of course, physical and mental health, which I think makes sense when it comes to pain. And then when we're talking about the fourth point within slide 50, we're talking about pain in one location of the body increasing the threshold for another area. And that can be, of course, only if those two things happen. A, those two locations are located on the same pathway. And it's actually kind of the same idea, but taking it a bit further. And the second option, it would be what we talked about, referred pain or radiating pain. Okay, so on slide 51, in the first point, we're talking about perceptual dominance of pain. And this is something that I've opened the first presentation, the first video with, and that is the idea of relative information or sensing. And that is that when you have multiple locations of pain, you react to the one that is omitting the most pain of all. And I want to give you an example from a different scenario, but that works almost the same. Let's say that you have several sources of noise, but one is way louder than the other. In a way, it's going to mask the other noises, and you're just going to hear the loudest source. Okay? In the same way, if we look at vision, let's say that you have several objects that are one behind the other. And let's say that the first one is the biggest. In that case, in certain angles, you won't see what's behind it. It's going to mask what's going behind it, but it doesn't mean that there's not other objects behind it. So in this case, just take the same idea, the same principle, and apply it to pain. So that's what we're talking about in the first point of slide 51. And then I want to jump to slide 54. We're talking about temperature regulation. Once again, regulation is a very important process. And you can see that the way that decisions are made is according to what we call the core temperature of the body. And of course, there's no such real thing. It's a theoretical idea, as if all the temperature or the heat of the body is concentrated in one area. But of course, different areas of the body have different temperatures. So when you say body temperature of 36, you're relating to core temperature, which is once again a theoretical idea. It doesn't really exist. Okay, one of the, if we go to slide 55, we can understand that one of the problems with increased body temperature or core temperature or local temperature and dysregulation of temperature is that we have molecules that have biological functions, physiological functions, that lose their structure. They undergo what we call denaturation, the loss of structure, usually at the third level, 3D level, and then they lose function, and if they lose function, that can be lethal. The first obvious example would be protein denaturation, and that's why when you have fever or high fever, it becomes very dangerous and even life-threatening. And that's kind of basic, and I hope you remember that from your basic studies in biology. If we relate to slide 58, you can see that the first point says as follows: heat can be produced via chemical or mechanical mechanisms. So the chemical, for instance, would be heat loss or energy loss to the environment, right? And the mechanical would be creating friction or elevating friction, which is immediately transformed into heat. And that connects between the first point and the third, whereas we can see that in such a case, when we want to induce mechanical based heat, we use the muscles, the skeletal muscles, and we just cause them to shiver. In other words, we're causing the sarcomeres and the fibers of the muscle to increase their friction, and by that produce heat, which is then either conserved in the muscle at first and then lost to the environment, which is a very simple idea. In a way, if you take your hands and go like this, you feel you're producing friction between your hands, and that produces the heat, right? And then you can take this heat and just let it radiate to the environment, or you can touch an area in your body and transmit that that heat. So that's basically the same idea. Then you can look at slide number 59, and basically I hope that the bottom line that comes across from this slide is the idea of a hormonal cascade. Notice how the endocrine system is inducing heat, or can induce heat loss even, by a cascade of hormones. You see here at least 3 to 4 hormones that lead to that shivering of the skeletal muscles in order to induce heat loss through friction. And then you also see an interesting point in slide 60, which is the last point, talking about involuntary behaviors, whereas the brain induces bundling up, movement, curling up, to prevent heat loss and even generate heat. This means that you cannot control these movements exactly like you're not exactly controlling behavior-wise the shivering of your muscles. Okay. If we look at slide number 61, of course, we have in the first point, we have different ways of losing heat to the environment. I'll just want to emphasize that, wait a minute, I apologize, sorry. I'm not going to start recording the whole video from the start, so I apologize. Only human. Of course, some of these processes are more dominant during rest, and some are more dominant during exercise or any situation that is not rest. Okay, then we start talking about fever, and I want to jump to slide number 64, and notice that fever is setting a new set point to the system, and that causes heat production that raises core temperature, and that's an important point to emphasize in this regards. Then if you look at slide 65 and you go to the second point, you see that any fever of unknown origin, FUO, basically can originate from anything if you look at the list of reasons, right? So anything can cause that, which makes it very problematic. Of course, I want to emphasize once more, especially for the exam, but not only, but especially, that I want you to remember the definitions of every condition and the unique aspects of every definition, and then how could you understand from a scenario that I give you with a person that is what's going on there. Okay, moving on to slide 67. I want to emphasize within the title, which is Thermal Regulation Disorders, that we're talking about disorders, not diseases. There's a difference between the definitions, okay? So usually we're talking about the lack of regulation, over-regulation, or under-regulation, and anything that might influence the occurrence of regulation, such as the nervous system and its problems. So we can talk about hypothermia. I think that the first 3 slides within this topic are self-explanatory, kind of simple to understand. I don't think there's anything out of the usual. I do want to go to slide number 72 and emphasize the whole idea, and it's also in slide 71, the idea of sodium loss. We're talking about ion pumps and ion imbalance. And when you're talking about that, definitely going to influence the nervous system. The ion pumps are obviously at the level of the cell. And once again, you have to understand that when we talk about the nervous system operates on an ionic cascade to produce those impulses. That's one of the major principles and mechanisms. So if you are going to influence the ability to induce such cascades, you're going to affect the ability of the nervous system to conduct and produce electrical impulses and hence function. I want to talk a bit about heat exhaustion. It starts in slide number 73, and this is something that I take very seriously. I have unfortunately bad experiences with it, especially with my background in the military and coming from Israel, which is definitely a hot environment. If you're talking about July and August in the Middle East, in the desert, guess what? You're asking for it. So we want to notice 2 points in slide 73 and then 74. One, the noticeable versus non-noticeable possible symptoms. And I say possible, although usually the worse it gets, all of them are going to appear. I also want you to notice the second and third point in slide number 74, which gives you a physiological cascade of responses. So I want to go over that for a second, and I'm starting from the second point, which starts with the word mechanism. So we're talking about dehydration that increases viscosity. Viscosity, the more viscous a solution is, and in this case we're talking about the blood tissue, the lesser it tends to move, or the more it resists to movement or change of position. That means that it's harder to pump blood, it's harder to circulate blood, and the importance of that is you have a drop in certain areas of blood pressure, which is problematic because blood pressure is used as a tool of function and has important implications on function. But the most important part, probably, or it's basically combined, it comes together if you think about it, is that blood is supposed to discard of any metabolites and CO2 that you don't want in the system, and CO2 can be deadly at high concentrations, and equally important, deliver oxygen. And when you don't deliver oxygen, bad things start to happen. So you can see that if it's harder to push blood around or circulate blood, and I say push just to emphasize the mechanical aspect of things, you have a decreased stroke volume. If stroke volume is decreased, in order to maintain the exact cardiac output, you have to increase heart rate. So that immediately happens. If you're increasing heart rate, immediately the interpretation of that in our field is that intensity goes up. If cardiac output decreases because you're not able to cope with and adapt to the situation, then you are supplying less oxygen than needed, aka hypoxia. If you are supplying less oxygen than needed, then your ability to produce ATP via the mitochondria is decreased, hence you are producing more energy in anaerobic pathways, and with one of them, hence the anaerobic glycolysis, you are producing lactate, and lactate or lactic acid is an acid, and the increase of such acid produces acidosis. And as we've talked before and mentioned before, acidosis impairs the ability of the neural system, the nervous system, to function either partially or completely, which is always a bad idea. The same cascade is going to happen if you forget someone, especially vulnerable populations such as the elderly or children or infants, in a car in the summer when it becomes blazing hot. It's basically the same idea. The only way to break this cascade or circle of death, because it leads to death, if not corrected, is to do one of three things. Either provide tons of water to that person, stop exercising if that's what you're doing, remove yourself from the heat, basically, counteract any one of the reasons that are causing blood to become viscous. Okay, so we see where we go to heat stroke, and in the last point in slide 75 under unique symptoms, I wrote absence of sweating. Now, initially you might say this doesn't make sense. If core temperature goes up and the regulation of sweating is according to core temperature only, not the influencers, what you're reading as core temperature, once again, it's a theoretical phrase. Then how can it be that we stop sweating? We stop sweating because while water is taken in order to sweat and try and cool the body first from the plasma, at some point it exceeds a certain point and you will start taking it from the cells. So you might find a phase where there's no water to take. That is a very dangerous point to reach. So if a person, if his or her core temperature is going up and they stop sweating, very bad situation. Okay, we can see in slide 76 in the second point, all those indications that are not noticeable possible symptoms. These are very bad symptoms, and obviously you can't see them with the naked eye, but if this is happening, you're in a very bad situation. And you can see that at some point, part of the mechanism is that you completely lose the ability to regulate thermal aspects of the body. And if you're losing it completely, then all hell breaks loose. Then we can see the malignant hypothermia, which is a lethal complication of a rare inherited muscle disorder. And once again, the muscles are unique organs that have a special status in the body. They are the major clients during exercise or anything that is not rest. Even at rest, they receive between 18 to 20% of the supplies of blood and oxygen, which makes them still a very important organ or tissue, but ever more in exercise. So if you have an inherited disorder in your muscles, under heat conditions or extreme conditions that affect heat and core temperature, there is definitely going to be a massive and important factor influencing the body. So, for instance, if we're talking about that shivering that is caused hormonally, in order to induce heat, what happens when you lose the control over that system? Now you have muscles that are contracting and shivering and creating heat, and since your muscle mass is one of the greatest masses in your body, you're talking about a major influencer that can bring you close to death, if not to death, very fast. By the way, if to be a bit of negative thoughts, that is exactly what chemical warfare plays upon in certain gases and weapons, or chemical weapons, causing that loss of regulation and supervision of the muscles and causing them to shiver, lose energy, leading to fatigue, protein denaturation, elevating core temperature, influencing blood viscosity, hypoxia, and at the end, death. Okay, when we talk about the basic sarcomere, and I'm relating to slide 79 to the second point on that slide, we're talking about calcium, and you have to understand that calcium has multiple responsibilities and functions in the body. One of them is that it is a biophysical regulator of weight, which influences the sarcomere's ability to contract or connect. Without it, you will have a problem creating those cross bridges. If you lose control over it, you lose control over muscle contractions, and if it's increased, meaning that you have increased levels of free calcium within your skeletal muscles, the muscle is going to contract more and more, and basically it's going to consume oxygen like crazy. It's going to cause fatigue, even to the point of death. Okay, if we look at hypothermia, and I think that slide 81 is kind of simple to understand. Let's go to slide 82. And the first point in slide 82 talks about the formation of ice crystals. And I want to explain why is this interesting, not only as a symptom that in theory should help you recognize under a microscope, of course, what's going on, but why is it such a severe condition? If you look at the cell and you assume, and this is, there's two theories in biology and physiology. If you assume that the cell has a given size, then you're limiting the content or the volume of the cell. So suddenly, if you have ice crystals, they're taking up a lot of room. When they take up a lot of room in a small cell, you're talking about a mechanical disturbance to the cell. And obviously, that means that you have the formation of ice, literally ice, in your cells, meaning that you're losing so much energy, or heat, sorry, which is a form of energy to be exact, that you're influencing the cell both chemically, thermally, and space-wise, mechanically. So that's a very bad place to be in. Then the last point is that metabolism is slowed down. It's slowed down on multiple levels. The loss of heat is the loss of energy, which is used for movement, both growth and chemical movement. Reactions do not happen under certain temperatures, especially DNA expression, or gene expression, I should say. Heat is energy. Energy can be harnessed to movement. Everything is slowed down. Everything, and sometimes doesn't even happen. So it would be like going from 2 lanes in a road to 1. Everything slows down. Okay, we'll stop here and we'll continue in the third video.